Well, hello, my friends. It has been quite some time since we hung out, and quite a bit has changed in the world since you last saw me and I last saw you. Um, yeah, I mean, we've got schools closing and church closing and sports are closing. The world is pretty freaked out right now. I'm hoping that wherever you see this, you're hunkered down safely with your family, and you guys are taking precautions to be safe through this time. But we as a church, well, I can't speak for everybody, but I could speak for me. It's really difficult for me to not be in touch with you guys. So this is one of our attempts to try and remain in contact with you guys, simply by making these videos and just so you have something to uh, to pull up on your computers on Sundays, just to have some semblance of Sunday school and some normalcy of Sunday school class and some of that stuff. So I hope this video finds you well. And yeah, one of my main focuses for making these videos is for you guys to just have a topic of discussion that you can have with your student. That's typically how our Sunday mornings go, anyways. As we've been running through a series where we talk about questions, and so I'll post one of their questions that they've proposed to me, and that has anything to do with anything about the Bible, about church, about God, whatever their questions may be. And then we kind of hammer through that, and we use biblical evidence, and we talk through kind of the truths and the questions, and it's been a really fun time of discussion, but it's a lot of back and forth discussion based stuff. So what I'm going to try and do through this video is simply give you guys the content so that you can have that discussion at home with your students. So without further ado, I will go ahead and intro our first lesson for today. This is going to be a review lesson because it's such a big one that I felt like we needed more than one Sunday to go over it. And it's such a foundational one when talking about all kinds of different other arguments that we have. The question for today is, how do I know the Bible is true? This is a big question, and I've told them this. This is a question that adults still grapple with, and whether they are thinking about this question themselves or they they have simply heard other people ask the question. Um, it's a good one for us all to make sure we have solid answers for, because it's kind of what we base our whole faith off of. This one book called the Bible. Is this thing legit? Like, if it is, then I can move forward. But if it isn't, then why am I wasting my time? And so we spent our first week. We started this 2 weeks ago, and then we kind of piggybacked off of it last week. But there was hardly anybody there, so we're gonna just kind of I'm going to reiterate a lot of things that we did last week. So for those of you that were here last week, this is a chance for you to go deeper in what we've talked about, and those of you that weren't, this is fresh content for you, hopefully. Um, the first week we talked about some of the craziness that's found in the Bible. We talked about some of the amazing, fantastical things like a talking donkey, or a man who's swallowed by a fish and survives for 3 days and walks out of it totally unscathed and fully alive. We talked about the fact that people are raised from the dead. Um, I brought up stories that they didn't know of, like 42 teenagers being mauled by a bear for making fun of an old bald guy. All these things are found in the Bible. And so it's a perfectly logical question for somebody who knows nothing about faith and nothing about Christianity, nothing about the Bible, to have heard or read some of these stories and going, "You're telling me this actually happened?" And yeah, we are telling them this actually happened. So if we're going to make such a bold claim to say that there's talking animals and there's dudes that are surviving, living inside of a fish for days on end, we need to have some answers for, is this really true? So then we dug into, okay, so how do we know that anything is true? The first thing that I gave them was just a simple example of made a statement of how do you know that that chair will hold your weight, right? So if I make a claim that it is true that that chair you're sitting in will hold your weight, how do we test that out to be true? Well, we look for proof, right? And the proof is simply I sat in it, it held my weight, therefore it's true. So I'm looking for proof, I'm looking for evidence, which leads into our next question of what proof or evidence do we have that the Bible is true? So here's where I'm going to give you your content to kind of discuss and investigate on your own. I think the fact that we're already on the internet, if you're watching this video, you're already on the internet, so you're already there with all kinds of amazing resources at your fingertips. And so I'm just simply going to give you some types of evidence that we have that the Bible's true, and then I'm going to challenge you to go ahead and dig into it yourselves and come up with specific evidence. So some of the types of evidence that we discussed last Sunday were first historical evidence, and simply, and I think these are kind of two categories that kind of run together. Documentation. It kind of runs side by side with history because throughout history, this manuscript we now call the Bible, or these manuscripts that have been collected into what we now call the Bible, have overgone all kinds of rewritings and translations and all these things, which actually is one of the things that people use against the validity of the Bible. But if you really look into the depth of it, it actually can argue quite the contrary. The manuscripts of the Bible are some of the oldest and most documented manuscripts that we have, and there's nothing really even that comes close. When you think of ancient texts, the Bibles and the many different pieces of evidence that we have throughout history, and the sheer volume of it, speak to the validity of this book that's overcome decades and centuries, not decades, sorry, millennia actually, a very, very long time. And there's no other ancient text that we have that have multiple copies that we can compare to. The very simple example of that is if you have two texts side by side that are talking about they're the same exact manuscripts, it's two copies of each other, and say that there's one particular error in there, you only have the two to compare it against to figure out what was actually the original writing. And that could be a very simple comparison. I saw one example online that said Joan is great, and then the other text says John is great, right? It's just a simple spelling of the word John, J-O-A-N or J-O-H-N, right? And something that simple can really cause a lot of turmoil. But when you only have the two, and one says this and one says this, how do we know which one is correct, right? That's how you would have a lot of our ancient manuscripts. When you talk about old writings of ancient, like Greek philosophers or Egyptian writings that go farther back than that, we have one or two copies of these ancient texts, and we take a lot of those things as, hey, this is history, and we're going to put this in the history books. Nothing comes close to the Bible, where we have tons of different copies. And so we take that example where we have the two that stand side by side. Joan is great, John is great. Well, if we have 15 others that say John is great, or vice versa, Joan is great, well, we know, okay, this one was simply the one that was the outlier, and that's the mistake. But because there's so many different copies that have been made throughout time of the Bible, because people have felt this is such an important book that we need to continue to remake more copies and more copies and more copies so it can be distributed, because of the Bible, the influence of the Bible, there are so many different manuscripts that are out there. And so there's no other ancient text that has so many copies that can continue to point back to each other, to itself, really, and scream, "Hey, this is valid. This is a legit book." So, does that prove that it's the Word of God in and of itself? No, not necessarily, but it does bring a lot of validity to the text and the sincerity to at least the original text, at least as close as we can get from this end of history. But also, there's also the historical evidence that we look at that is reinforced by other extra biblical text, and that's a big word. Excuse me. That's a big word that really means other books that are not the Bible, found in history that point to similar or same historical events that are listed and found in the Bible, but also reinforced by other texts and other things throughout history. There's several examples of this. Again, this is where I'm going to offer the challenge to you parents and students to dig into some of these. What are specific historical examples? Is there one that I can find that is backed up by other books and other writings and other resources outside of the Bible that reinforce what the Bible says to be true? Along with that is another one which we would call archaeological evidence. This is one that we talked about in class last Sunday for the handful of kids that were there with me. Having gone to Israel, it's one of the Israel teams a few years back. It's like everywhere you turn, there's another archaeological find. It's crazy when you walk the land of the Bible, how much archaeology is still there. And archaeology is the study of things of the past and buildings and evidence that are still around. Because of the building materials that they use, there's no organic material that's still there, but there's lots of stone and things that we can still look to. The walls of Jericho, for instance, would be an example of that. So again, I would challenge you to look into some of that as you study with your student. The final one I'm going to leave you with, which is what I think is the strongest points of evidence for the Bible and the legitimacy of the Bible, and the answer to how do I know the Bible is true, would be the example of prophecy that's found in the Bible. If we had one statement, one prophet, so to speak, that made a bold claim, something as ridiculous as a virgin birth, or I don't know, you name it, this Messiah that comes back to life after being dead for 3 days. Some of these bold claims that are made in the Bible. If we just had one of those things that came true in our lifetime, we would take notice, and we would take notice very, very seriously. But the Bible is full of prophecy, hundreds, if not thousands, of prophecies that are fulfilled, and not just generic prophecies like the sun will come up tomorrow. Like we could all be prophets if that's the case, but these are very specific prophecies that come true either in the life of Israel, the life of Jesus, or you have what there's so many different examples. I would challenge you and your student to dig up a few of those. Just you can do very simple searches online, and they'll bring up list after list after list of prophecies that are made. Look at some of those specifically. At Christmas time, we studied some of the prophecies just centered around Jesus' birth, and that's a fascinating study in and of itself. The fact that there's so many specific prophecies about Jesus in particular, and they all come true in the life of this one guy. That is way beyond coincidence, guys. And that's something that we can truly build our faith on. And it's something that legitimizes the Bible immensely. So go dig into this yourselves. Go look into this with your parents, students, and have this discussion. And make sure you walk away from this study feeling more confident in your beliefs and more confident in this book that we call the Bible, that we found this belief on. I hope you guys are all well from my side of the quarantine to yours. God bless you.